Well, Happy New Year as well. Here's something you can think about it. It occurred to me yesterday, and I'm a little slow, okay? But this is the start of a new decade. Well, every new year is the start of a new decade. This just happens to be the start of a decade that starts with a 0, right? And I was thinking about New Year's resolutions. I don't do that, but many do, and that's wonderful. But it had dawned on me that what if we thought a little longer term than thinking about New Year's resolutions for this year? What if we thought this way? What could I do this year that would set me up for the decade? That in 10 years from now, what I do this year, how I align my life with Jesus, the way that I get to know him throughout this year, not just the first week, but throughout this year, what effect might that have on this decade 10 years from now and who I would become 10 years from now? I find that a much more interesting thought than setting something up just for this year. But do with that as you wish. That's got nothing to do with really what I'm talking about today. It's just something I've been thinking about. But what is on my mind this morning is something that we talk about 2 times a year, and we have in March, we'll be 22 years old as a church, and every first weekend in January and then the first weekend in September, we talk about that which has animated us these last almost 22 years, and that which is going to animate us going into the future, that which gives us life and gives us purpose and meaning as a community of faith. So much of it is like within each one of us, but then we're also a family together. And so we have a couple of times a year talked about what it is that we think Jesus has put on our church's shoulders and our hearts and our minds to do. And I realized in the last week how important it is to remind ourselves of that and go back to this over and over again. Somebody has said that vision leaks about every 30 days. And it does. And so it's really important. I had 3 conversations in the last week that were informative to me in this. First conversation was with a pastor from another state who was here visiting some friends and family over the Christmas time. And he hadn't kind of interacted with Copper Hills before, so we got together and had a coffee over here at the coffee shop. And one of the interesting things that he asked, this is kind of what pastors talk about. So what's the purpose Jesus has given you? Like, what's the unique thing that you're about? And as I shared with him a little bit of the history and what Jesus has done and what animates us, I found my own joy and passion and interest in what Jesus is doing here just grow inside of me. I said it like at one point to myself, I said, oh man, like if I wasn't the pastor of that church, that's a church I'd want to be a part of, right? That's a fantastic idea. It's a fantastic dream. It's an incredible vision that this community of faith has and how Jesus has fueled that over these years. Later that day, second conversation, I was leaving work and I park over on this far side of the parking lot. And as I got closer to my car, there's a family, a mom and a dad and 2 kids, probably 6 and 3, something like that. And they're loading a couple of bikes up in the back of their SUV. So I went over and I introduced myself and wished them a Happy New Year. And they said, hey, thank you. Dad says, hey, thank you so much for letting us use your parking lot. Been teaching the kids how to ride bike. And a little 6-year-old girl, like I said, is that a bike you got for Christmas? And she proudly says, oh, yeah. And I don't have training wheels like my brother does. She was evidently very proud of her progress as a bike rider. And so Dad says, thank you for letting us ride in your parking lot. I didn't want to have my kids learn to ride on our streets in our neighborhood because it's just busy. And so, that makes sense. I said, but by the way, it's your parking lot. He went, what? No, we don't go to this church. I said, yeah, but you kind of live in the north part of our city here, right? Yep, that's your parking lot. In fact, this whole complex, this whole campus is yours. We built it for you. And he looked at me kind of strange and he said, well, I don't get it. What are you talking about? I said, well, like a group of us have been around like a couple of decades, and about a dozen years ago, we decided that we really wanted to build something that our community would see as a meeting place for themselves. By then, we had discovered that we as a church family could meet about anywhere from a theater to parks to smelly gyms, to cafeterias, and like where we met didn't matter all that much, but we knew that our community wouldn't just meet anywhere, that they would call it like their place. And so we talked to our community and said, what could we build that you would see as your gathering place? And so by virtue of that, we've just given this back to the community to use, and we're kind of the primary tenant. We pay for it, but it's really a gift to our community. So I've never heard of something like that before. I said, yeah, that's kind of the heart of where we're at. He said, well, like this isn't my church, but is there something I could do to be part of that? I said, yeah, sure. Why don't you come by sometime? I'll give you a tour and take a look around. You get a little bit of a sense of who our family is. And he was just really marveling at that a church would actually prioritize not their own convenience, but to create space in a community. I thought, oh man, I'm glad I'm part of that. I'm just so glad that that's what Jesus has led us into. And then third conversation, New Year's Eve day, we have some friends from out of town that used to be part of Copper Hills like 15 years ago. And they'd since moved to another city, but they were back for an event here in the city. And so, of course, they wanted to see what had happened here and give the tour through our kids area and tell some of the stories of how that is, impacting the lives of kids and how it's grown. And of course, started in the coffee shop and took them over to the Center for the Arts and explained what was happening there and what that was all about. And as we're going through the tour, she turns to Elfie and myself and says, okay, so we were part of this 15 years ago, meeting in a school. This is what you were talking about. It's actually happening. And I thought, something that to have a vision that doesn't shift and change, to have some consistency to it, to have a vision that's actually locked in the DNA of a church family is really, really important. It is for any organization, but more so because there's nothing more important on the face of the earth than what Jesus has deputized as his representation here on earth, which he calls his bride and his body. And he has invited us to be, in a sense, mistaken for him in this world so that people would think of him the way we function. In fact, at one point, Jesus says, the whole world's going to know that you're legit by how you love one another. Because they're desperately wanting to see if there is some place in this world where people just love one another sacrificially and honestly and with integrity. And then there's a shot that they might be loved that way as well. And it's an incredibly attractive and compelling idea that our culture longs to know. They don't know that's what they're looking for. But to the degree you and I understand that, that's the influence we have. And so I want to spend a little bit of time. This is like the 43rd time going back over what it is that animates us. And I want to start here. A couple of years ago, I discovered a book written actually 10 years ago already, almost 11 years ago, by a guy named Simon Sinek. He's a British-born American who's cut his teeth in kind of the marketing world. And 10 years ago, he came out with this book called Start With Why. You might have familiar. It was really popular in the business world. And the whole idea behind it was this premise that humans tend to be motivated either by coercion, convincing and selling something to them, or by inspiring them. The sustainability of what motivates them is dependent on how they're motivated. And he would say in his book, if you get the why clear, the purpose clear for yourself, you're going to be much more sustainably motivated. Now, he came up with what he calls the golden circle. You start with why and then what and how as a way of presenting ideas. And part of that is inspirational in itself, but he misses a really important piece to it, a really important piece. You see, his idea was you find your why. You do that for yourself. You find your why, and that will inform your what and your how. I would say that might apply in our lives to some degree until we become followers of Jesus. And then the who takes over. Because you get your why from the who. If you get your why from yourself, that is not actually all that bright. But when you get your why from who made you, who loves you, who gave his life for you, and he has some say in your why, Well, that just opens up the boundaries of meaningful living for here and forever. So, I want to take that golden circle of Simon Sinek, and we've done this a couple other times, and I want to go to the core of it. I want to talk with us about like our who, and then we'll look at the why, and then we'll look at the what and the how. You ready for that? So what I want to do with you is I want to take you back to a passage of scripture that we looked at last month, it just describes who our Messiah Savior is. It's taken from a letter that first century church planter and dynamic leader, a guy by the name of Paul, writes to a church that he helped establish in the city of Colossae. He gets it going and then he leaves for a period of time, and at some point he wants to write them a letter to encourage them and remind them who they are and remind them whose they are and what they're about. And this is the way early on in his letter, this is how he starts. He says, I'm going to tell you about who Christ Jesus is, because he's the who. So in verse 15 of chapter 1, he says, Christ is the visible image of the invisible God, in case you were wondering. Sound familiar? We just read it a month ago. He existed before anything was created and is supreme over all creation. Number one, above everything. For through him, God created everything in the heavenly realms and on earth. He made the things that we can see and the things we can't see, such as thrones and kingdoms, rulers and authorities in the unseen world. Everything was created through him, and get this, for him. We weren't created for ourselves. We were created for him. He existed before anything else, and he holds all creation together. So in case you think things are coming apart in the Middle East and there's catastrophe and there's chaos, there is some of that, but there's somebody that's got his arms around it. He holds all creation together. Christ is also the head of the church. That's us. He's not head of an organization, though there's organizational parts. He's head of the body, the bride, the being, the entity, the organism, which is his body. He is the beginning, supreme over all who rise from the dead. So he is first in everything. He is at the center of that golden circle. For God in all his fullness was pleased to live in Christ, and through him God reconciled everything to himself. He made peace with everything in heaven and on earth by means of Christ's blood on the cross. And that includes you and me. It's a marvelous, incredible statement. How is it? We talked about this Christmas Eve. How is it possible that a God who has no bounds, no time, is beyond everything, is the maker of everything, somehow was able, without giving up one stitch of his deity, to compress all of who he is into an embryo the size of half a grain of sand? Like, how did he do that? And then that embryo becomes a little baby and becomes a young man and becomes a man. But he's human in every way, but without giving up any of his deity. Like, this is just an amazing, amazing reality of the person that we follow, who calls us his own, who wants to do life with us. Nobody else has this. And he's made this available to every human being. Whoever would say, you know, I think the self-saving, self-redeeming, putting myself together, it's just not led to the life that I really thought it would. It's actually a little disappointing. To which Jesus comes along and goes, okay, would you like to live with me? It'll be interesting at least. It'll be actually amazing. You get to come on, live in my kingdom with me. Where you take your stuff that you're king and queen over and you bring it to me, and out of my love and grace and goodness for you, you get to live with me. The maker of the whole universe, the one who gave up his life for you, that's who I am. Now, if you want that, I won't force you into that. It's an invitation, but you're going to have to make a decision. At some point, a thoughtful, clear decision that your affiliation, the who of your heart, is now me. And when you make that decision, I'm promising you, you won't know it till you experience it, but I'm promising you're going to become a new person. And the center and the core of your purpose is just going to be revolutionized, not a tweak on what you had till now. Brand new. But that's an invitation that he has made. And I have yet to find someone who has said yes to that who's ever been disappointed. But I have found a bunch of people who are afraid of it, who are uncertain of it, and never really research it, never ever. They somehow bank it on, well, I was born in a Christian home. That's not the same thing. I was confirmed in my church. That's not the same thing. I know the Bible really well. I go to church right now. No, that's not the same thing. In fact, it's radically different because you're still the who at the center of your life at that point. And what Jesus offers is to come and be your who. And that is who the who of this church is and what our vision is. It's all about him. You can't go higher up the ladder than that. You can't get a more loving, more gracious, more profound, more powerful, more anything than Jesus being our who. And because he's our who and will always be, nothing will ever shift from that. We derive our why individually and collectively as a church from him as well. Can I read a little further in this quote from this letter that Paul writes? I didn't read this last month. This is how it says. So let's pick it up from the part that says, this includes you. And then he goes on to say this. This includes you who were once far from God, right? Truthful statement. You were his enemies. We don't like to think of that, right? But if you're far from him, there's a reason why you're far from him, why we're separated from him, which he didn't separate us, by the way. We did that one. That was our choice to kind of live independent, and he let us do that. So you were his enemies, separated from him by your evil thoughts and actions, yet now he has reconciled you. You did nothing to be reconciled. You just relented. He reconciled to himself through the death of Christ in his physical body. As a result, he has brought you into his presence. That's the why. The who informs our why. The why is that he's brought us into his own presence, and you're holy. Get that? You're holy and you're blameless as you stand before him without a single fault. That's who I want to know. But you must continue to believe this truth and stand firmly in it. Don't drift away from the assurance you received when you heard the good news. The good news has been preached all over the world, and I, Paul, have been appointed as God's servant to proclaim it. I'm glad when I suffer because this created a lot of pain for him, and oddly enough, it does for many of us as well. When we really lock in with who and our why is informed because it directs our whole life, it creates discomfort for us in some ways. For I am participating in the sufferings of Christ, as are we, that continue for his body, the church. God has given me the responsibility of serving his church. Evidently a really important entity, right? By proclaiming his entire message to you. This message has been kept secret for centuries and generations past, but now it has been revealed to God's people. For God wanted them to know that the riches and glory of Christ are for us too. Non-Jewish DNA folks, for us too. And this is the secret. This is the why. Christ lives in you. Who? Christ. Why? He lives in us. And that animates everything that we do. Everything that we do. It gives you assurance of sharing in his glory. So who are we? Well, we have Christ the who lives in us. Why do we do that? Because he lives in us and he's made us new, and we are increasingly becoming different kinds of people. Okay, so that's the who and that's the why. Well, what's the what? Well, we say it like this around here. This is our what. We want to help one another increasingly be with Jesus, so that we increasingly think like him, so we are increasingly mistaken for him. What does all that mean? That means this. Because of who Jesus is, and because he has come to live inside of our souls, those that have said yes to his invitation, it informs our why, and the what is, well, we just want to help each other increasingly do all of life every moment with Jesus. Because this is his invitation. His spirit lives in us. This is for people that don't actually think about Jesus a lot, or they don't think well of him, or they're not all that interested. You know what we want to do? We want to be the kind of people who are mistaken for Jesus, that just by our life and our word and our actions, because our who is clear and our why is clear, and the what we do becomes attractive, and they actually start to think about Jesus, or they think well of Jesus because of who we are becoming. It's an amazing idea. And so this is what our what is. So again, a little further in the letter, Paul writes this. After writing about who and why, he says, so here's your what. So we tell others about Christ. And that is not always the spoken word. We tell others by our lives, by how we're good neighbors, by how we work in the marketplace, by the kind of students we are, by the kind of integrity, by the kind of graciousness and generosity and joy that we carry in our lives. So we tell others about Christ, warning everyone and teaching everyone with all the wisdom that God has given us. You see, here's what we're about. We want to present them, all of us in our community around us, we want to present them to God, perfect in their relationship to Christ, just like we have been given ourselves. That is why I work and struggle so hard, depending on Christ's mighty power that works within me. That's what we want to be about. So who? Jesus. Why? Because of what he's done for us. The what? So we can be models of who Jesus is in a world around us. So how do we do that? How does that happen for us? Well, there is a story that John, Jesus' friend, reminds us of, that an encounter that Jesus has in John chapter 4 that has been kind of pivotal in us thinking out, how do we do this? If Jesus is our who and he animates our why and what he's done in us, how are we going to reveal that? It's a simple story, but it's so profound. Jesus is in the southern part of Israel, and he's going to head up north to his home in the northern Galilee region. And rather than take the Jordan River Valley up, which was the logical, normal, safe route to go, he goes up through the central part of Israel, through an area called Samaria, which was the bad neighborhood. It's not the part you wanted to actually go through. I was reminded this morning as I was thinking of that. In early 1990s, there were riots that happened in Los Angeles. Some of you will remember that, like 60-some people lost their lives, and there was 6 days of riots and whatnot. Well, Alfie and I, right on the heels of that, were in Los Angeles, and we were flying. We lived out in the east, and we were going to take a red-eye flight. So right around midnight, we're heading back to the airport. We're going to fill the car up with gas and get on a plane and fly home. Well, we get off the freeway south of the airport, and we're meandering through the streets of Los Angeles, and finally we see this gas station that's open at that hour. Pull in. I walk up to the window where you got to pay before you fill, and there's 3 panes of bulletproof glass, and the guy looks at me and says, "What the are you doing here?" So I'm getting gas for my car. He says, "No, you're not. You got to get out of here. You're as white as white. You're as blonde as blonde. Your blue eyes sparkle in the dark. And you're driving a really nice car. You do not want to be here right now. Do you not know what's going on?" They go, "No, I guess not." He said, "Give me your $20, fill your car, and get out of here. It's not safe. It's not the neighborhood you wanted to be in." Well, this wasn't the neighborhood Jesus wanted to be in, because there were decades, centuries of religious conflict with this group of people. But Jesus intentionally goes through this area. And about noon or so, he stops at a natural resting spot, which was a well just outside of a town. And there he sends his buddies off to go get lunch, and he stays at the well. And along comes a woman. You know the story, right? And she's there to get water, right? She's there to get water for her household, for cooking, for watering her sheep or camels, whatever it is that she's going to do. And Jesus sees her and does the socially unacceptable thing. He engages her in a conversation. Why was it socially unacceptable? Because this was a male-dominated, we would even say chauvinistic, maybe even misogynistic culture, where guys and gals just didn't talk, particularly if, it was at that time of day, because that spoke about something. Why is she there at noon? Because typically you would arrive early in the morning or late in the evening to gather water for the day or the next day, and here she is at noon. Why? It's the hottest part of the day. You just didn't go get water at that time. Well, most commentators would think, as the story unfolds, what the story tells us is that she was socially scorned. She was morally not acceptable. And here's Jesus, who's on a totally different plane, a different category completely. They have nothing morally in common. They certainly gender don't have that in common. They don't have religion in common. In fact, you could say that they're from the opposite side of the tracks. They have no reason to get along. Jesus has no reason to engage this woman, but he takes notice of her. And then he does the unthinkable thing. He takes interest in her and engages her. And he does the logical thing. He says, "Could you get me some water?" To which she says, it's really odd that you would ask me. Do you know what you're doing, Jesus? And he goes, oh yeah, if you just asked me, however, I've got like upgraded water for you. The kind of water that I would like to give you would be water that would be, well, living water, and it would be this never-ending spring of water inside of you. Not a bad offer, right? That means she wouldn't have to come to the well. She could just have it at home somehow, right? Turn on the living water spigot, I guess. She doesn't get it. Jesus does, but she doesn't. And so she says, well, give me some of that water. To which Jesus steps into what looks like a pretty insensitive thing. He says, well, go get your husband. And now something's on the table that she just doesn't want to talk about, because the truth of the matter is she's had 5 husbands, and I suppose like she could have been a widow 5 times over. Not likely, but it could be. If that's the case, then what tragedy that is, right? More than likely she had 5 marriages and they all didn't work out, and for whatever reason they were failures. And so she's with a guy right now who's her boyfriend. She's kind of given up on marriage. She's not going to marry this guy. She's going to live together, right? Because she needs someone to help and support her in that culture. But Jesus knows that, and for some reason he talks to her about that. And on the outside looking in it, you go, well, that is really insensitive, Jesus. Like, don't you know that that's a sensitive issue for her? That's a painful history for her. Why would you go there? Yeah, that is. Unless you've already broken through every one of the other cultural, religious, gender barriers, and you've taken interest in someone who you really shouldn't take interest in, you speak with grace and kindness, maybe that's exactly the right thing to talk about, because it is the area for her that has left her most scarred. She deflects it. She talks about religion for a little bit of time, and they circle around that. It's a bit of a conflict, and then at a really inopportune time, Jesus' friends come back with the Chick-fil-A, and they're going to serve up some lunch, right? And we don't really know exactly how that story is going to end. We're kind of left hanging till we read the passage. It says that she, following Jesus' friends coming back, she runs back to town, and she can't stop talking. And this is apparently what she says. Everybody who wouldn't talk to her before, she now wants to talk to. And she says, I met someone who knows everything about me and didn't condemn me. I've never experienced that in my life before. You ought to come out and see him, because I think he might just be the Messiah. I just think he might be. And this is what we read happens. This is how the story ends. In John 4:39, it says, many Samaritans from the village believed in Jesus because the woman had said, he told me everything I ever did. When they came out to see him, they begged him to stay in their village. Amazing, isn't it? These are enemies, skeptics, cynics, doubters, but they invite him to stay. So he stayed for 2 days, changed his plans, long enough for many more to hear his message and believe. And then they said to the woman, now we believe, not just because of what you told us in your experience, but because we have heard him ourselves. Now we know that he is indeed the Savior of the world. That was how Jesus did what he did. He took notice and he took interest in unlikely people for the purpose of informing them and making them religious and changing their behavior, not on your life. He did it so that the hope of eternity and hope here, life in his kingdom, could come to land in their souls and their hearts, and they would become new people, and they would have a new hope and a new destiny and a new direction, and they would have something called new life, which was the living water that he was talking about. And that's what he did throughout the 3 years that he was there. And ultimately he shows the pinnacle of what that looks like. He goes to a cross and dies. The God of the universe dies, because he's noticed the need and he's taken so much interest. And you and I sit here today because of what happened then. And we have just said as a church for 22 years, we're going to figure out what that what looks like here. We are going to take notice, and we're going to take interest in people, in one another, and in the community around us, because we really do believe that Jesus still has that as his mission. He really wants to help people understand what life with him is really like. He doesn't want to just get them to heaven and whatever happens here happens here. No. He wants to give them life to the full here. and then live that life to the full forever and ever and ever. And this is what he has given us to try to figure out how to do that in our context. And so for the last 22 years, we've been trying some things. We've been experimenting. We fail at stuff more than we're successful, honestly. But this is what we have said over and over again. It is not about getting people to come to a campus or to sit in chairs, or it's not. It's about you and me together who have the right who, the right what, the right why, the right what, and the right how. Engaging people wherever we find ourselves. You'll hear this around here a lot. You don't live where you live, work where you work, play where you play, learn where you learn. Because the house was such a good deal in just the right neighborhood, we stole it off the market, and it's just perfect for our family. The school that we go to is like, it's fantastic, it's convenient, or it gives me the right degree, and it's going to set my path for my career. Or the job I have is just perfectly suited to my needs, and it provides income for my family. And the hot yoga class, whoa, that's exactly what I need. It's not why you're there. It's not why you live there. It's not why you work there, play there, go to school there. You know why you do? Because Jesus has put you there in the hope that you'll increasingly do more and more life with him, increasingly think like him, and increasingly be mistaken him, so that our world, the people you work next to, your neighbors that live next to you, the people you go to school with, the person in the Peloton bike beside you, would somehow start to think that Jesus is beautiful and hopeful, and they too could find what you and I have. Do we do this perfectly? No. Shoot, there's a sign out here that says no perfect people allowed. And if you're perfect today, would you mind leaving? And none of us would. That means there's something attractive about that, because we want to be received with our imperfections. Don't change me first. Love me like I am. And that's what we want to do. You know what else it means? It means that you and I are in a family next to imperfect people. And we accept one another for our imperfections. We don't criticize and complain and shame and gossip and speak badly of one another. We don't do that. Because we're all imperfect. And this is what Jesus is working at, to make us new and fresh people so that we're like really legitimate in our community around us. That's the whole thing. So how do we do that? Well, you see the coffee shop over here? Do you know why it's called the Well? Because there was a well 2,000 years ago that Jesus met someone at. They came there for water. She came for water. And she walked away with living water and ran home and told everybody else, the great water over there. No, living water. He knows everything about me and received me. Our whole hope is this. Do you know that we gather around coffee in our culture? It's water. And our hope would be that if folks from our community, and we would bring our friends there, they would find living coffee. Now, they would find Jesus. And they would see it in us in conversations and sharing life together. And that's why it's called that. Because we see it as a place that we can gather around, come for coffee, and maybe over time you'll walk away with a fresh sense of who Jesus is. Center for the Arts. Why do we do that? Because about a dozen years ago, we met with every civic leader who would give me half an hour of their time. And we said, we want to build something that would be a gathering place for our community. What should we build? And in one way or another, all of these civic leaders said, don't build an athletic facility, don't build an academic, build something around the arts, because every time there's a downturn in the economy, the arts go away in our schools and in our community. And there's such a need for it. So we said, okay, so let's use the arts. Let's leverage the arts. Let's do that with the arts, where children and students and adults can come here and learn their artistic interests, their craft at a really high level. But they'll be taught by people who love them, who love Jesus more than they love them, so that they can love them accurately and truthfully and legitimately. And maybe they'll mistake us for Jesus, and they'll develop this interest in Christ. Just a couple of months ago, maybe a month and a half ago, one of the champions of our Center for the Arts contacted us and said, hey, I put a little video together. I wonder if you might be interested in that. So it worked. He does some filmmaking and that kind of thing. And so he sent it over to us. Can I show it to you? It's just a really cool depiction of what the Center for the Arts is all about. You know who the original creator is? It's the God of the whole universe. And he instilled creativity in each one of us. If you were to go back 500 years, the gospel message was presented and given to the world through the arts. Through painting and sculpture and music and poetry. It was the vehicle that God used to let the world know in a dark, dark time that there was still life, there was still hope, it was still Jesus Christ. We want to use the arts for that purpose, to do that for his fame. If you're interested in arts or technology, and there's like 30 different offerings, I'll bet your neighbors and friends and colleagues, fellow students are interested as well. Why don't you bring them? Why don't you bring them with you? Tell them about it. And who knows whether Jesus might just use us trying to figure out what the well looks like. And it turns out to be the arts, and it's a defining experience for them. There's so many other ways. I can't even go through them all with you. A couple of months ago, you'll recall, we had a couple of guys here on stage that we were interviewing who had both reached the end of their rope in terms of addictions, and like just done. And they turned their lives over to Jesus' leadership and found new life in him, just like Jesus does every time when people do that. And following that, we were just inundated with people who said, like nobody knows this about me, but I'm struggling with this addiction right here. I'm not sure my family even knows, but I know. I'm at the end. Can you guys help? And so for the last 4 or 5 weeks, there's been a group of people who are kind of working through addiction themselves, and they found Jesus to be like the higher power. They've been putting something together, and we'll tell you a little bit more early in February, but it's a support recovery kind of ministry that we want to start. But it's not just for us. We need it, right? There's many of us who just don't know a pathway out. We sit here in this group, and we silently struggle, and we silently limp. And Jesus wants to enter that and bring healing and wholeness. But there's a whole community around us that there are fantastic recovery programs. But this one is centered on who? The one who can really bring freedom to the soul and the heart and the life. And so we'll tell you a little more in February once it's in a place. But again, that's that whole initiative of taking notice and taking interest. There's so many of them, from life groups to a group of about 100 women, young moms that meet here through the week, and there's just so many other things that are happening here. Just this last week, we had 2 families from our community ask us whether we could allow our building, because they don't come here, whether we would allow our building and would we help walk through the death of a family member. Could we do that? They just didn't know where to turn. That is 22 years of a vision that our community is increasingly seeing, that Jesus just might be the hope of their universe. And this is why we do what we do, because of who we found. He informs our why. We have kind of thought through what the what would be, and now we're figuring out how to do that. And that is all to our King's fame and glory and for him alone. We serve a risen Savior, the Redeemer of our world. It's good news. And our community is dying to know who he is. They won't identify him maybe, but he is who they're looking for. Butch, why don't you come up with them? There's a song that's become a bit of, a reflection of our mission statement, to increasingly be with Jesus, and leads to increasingly thinking like him and increasingly being mistaken for him. And we're going to sing it together. I want you to notice a couple of lines in it along the way. One of the lines is, I give my dreams and desires, the best of me, my hopes, my dreams, my desires, I give those to you, Jesus. And I let you inform me, because you're my who. And you inform me of what my dreams and desires might look like in your hands. And then there's another line in it that says, the world is dying to know who you are. Do you still believe that Jesus wants to, through your life as his follower, impact the lives of people around you? Because he believes that. And he's put all his eggs in that basket that those who know him will represent him well. So would you stand? Let's sing this together.